me, photography, when I moved from fashion into covering the effects of conflict, I really saw it that I was an angry man with a camera. I wanted to create change, and photography was my tool. It was my way of doing that. And then the foundation kind of grew from that. And so the last couple of years, I realized actually the best use of my skills and time was on building the foundation, not my photography. And the photography, to a certain extent, was not a vanity project, but it was my creative side, but it actually wasn't the best, most effective use of my time. Now the foundation has grown to a size where I can go back to storytelling and focus on that as well. So it's nice. It's nice to be a photographer again.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Legacy of War Foundation and why you started that. So, I mean, I want to, there's so many things that I want to ask you, but since we're touching on it already, what made you decide to go into the NGO aspect of work, especially because you were working with NGOs for years at that point? What did you feel like was missing from that world?
I never wanted, photographers are loners. I spent my whole life, I've never had a job in my life. I've always worked for myself. So from the age of 17, I've had my camera, traveled. And the idea of actually setting up an organization goes against every instinct that I have. But it was born out of frustration. As simple as that as you said, I've worked with a lot of other organizations. I've worked in the field for 20 years. I've seen how they operate. And I'm not going to criticize anybody, but what I would say is I could see gaps and see how things can be done differently. And I realized nobody else was going to do that. And so many conversations I had, I'd say, why don't we try that? Why don't we do that? And people would say to me, yeah, but it's not that simple. You can't do it that way. I'm one of these people that tends to do things and then turn around to people and say, look, I've done it. And so that's where we set up Legacy of War Foundation, because I believed that the charity sector, and I'm using the word charity sector because I don't like that word, but it's how it works, this idea of Western kind of colonial charity of we bless you with our help, we support you, as opposed to looking at it in a problem solving lens and say, actually, most of these issues were caused by us in the first place. We're created by colonization, by imperialism, by taking resources out of countries, setting up systems that didn't work. And so I look at it that we are there as an organization to help communities to rebuild after conflict, but by using their skills, their resilience, their local knowledge, and we are there as a support network to help them do that. And I'm sure we'll touch on this more, was injured in Afghanistan, and we can talk about that later, but I spent a year in recovery going through rehabilitation. And what I learned then is a really good life lesson. I learned that you can't empower anyone else. And you will hear lots of organizations saying, we empower women in Africa, we empower children, we do this, we empower laborers in Bangladesh, whatever the project is. I realized that empowerment has to come from within, that nobody else could empower me to walk again. Nobody could empower me to live my life independently. What they could do is facilitate it. So I needed a support network of everything from physiotherapists, occupational therapists, doctors, surgeons, nurses. But they couldn't empower me. They supported me to do it. And that is part of when we set up Legacy of War Foundation. I said, we're not there to empower others. We're to break down the barriers that stop people empowering themselves. And as I say, many of those barriers were put up by, centuries of Western imperialism, colonization, etc. So Rwanda is a really good example where we have a project called Land for Women. And it was born from an amazing encounter with a woman called Olive, who's become a good friend. She's a genocide survivor. Her story is about forgiveness and rebuilding her life after losing her whole family to the genocide. And we just got on really well. We had quite a few beers. We were like having a feast together, cooking together, drinking. And I just said, look, what is it that I could do through my foundation to support you? And I think that's one of the first things we do is sit and listen to a community, actually ask them. And I know that sounds like such an obvious thing to do, but rarely happens. To actually sit with the community and ask them, what is the help that you need? And she said, well, look, we grow potatoes in the field. I have a small cooperative, but we make no money, because we don't own the land. We pay rent. And that's where the idea came up for Land for Women, where I thought the two things that were holding back these women, firstly was education, and the second was owning the land. So what we do is we buy the land, we hand ownership of the land to the women. We never say we give it, we say we return the land, and then we help them over a 5-year educational program. Then they empower themselves. It's as simple as that. And that's the ethos of everything that we do. So sorry, that's a really, really long-winded answer to your question. But in simple answer to why did I set up Legacy of War Foundation? Because I believed things could be done differently. And I wanted that opportunity to prove that to people.
And the benefit of the work that you're doing, you were in the field, one. So, I mean, I'm sure it came naturally where you're like, these people need wheelchairs. Mm-hmm. We need more, hospital workers on this side. So you had that, you were in the field and you saw exactly what needed to be done. But then also, I think the storytelling aspect is one of the first things that drops off as an organization builds. And you're a storyteller, by nature and by trade. And so I'm sure just the two of those things put together filled a gap that you saw.
So as a writer and photographer, I've learned over the years, I started with an unconscious bias as a photographer when I started doing documentary work. And what I mean by that is I traveled to Angola and I made photographs based on my whole upbringing of seeing imagery of Africa. I went there thinking, this is how I'm supposed to portray people living in conflict areas. This is how I'm supposed to portray people living in developed nations. And a good example of that is going to Angola just at the end of the Civil War. And a local priest had told me about this building. He said, you should go there. He was a keen photographer himself. He said, you should go there. It's very, very photographic. It's an old school and missionary. It's abandoned, but women are living there who are widows of the war. They cook there. There's smoke. It's very picturesque. You should go and photograph it. So I turned up there. The women ran off because they hadn't seen a man. They were worried about the government that was bringing revenge for the Civil War. Most of their husbands had been killed. And they ran off, and I was like, okay, I just need to sit around. Bit by bit, they would come back and get used to me being there. And it truly was, it looked like, a Sebastian Salgado or Don McCullen image of like, they would have fires, blackened walls. It was so, shafts of light coming in through broken windows. And as a photographer, I'm like, wow, this is incredible. And I was very, creating, they are beautiful images and people bought them to put on their walls and they are very strong, powerful images. But I look at those photographs now and yes, they're beautiful, but I am so annoyed at myself for the way I approached it because what I was doing was I thought I'm supposed to show them in this kind of reverence. It's supposed to look like these iconic images, that look almost more like a painting because these women are war widows and so serious. Actually, what had happened at that stage is the women had got so used to me, and a lot of these women were like in their 60s and 70s, real characters. They got so used to me that they used to sneak up behind me when I was trying to take a photograph and pinch my backside. And they thought it was hilarious, and they all burst into laughter if anyone managed them to do it. So they were doing this game. Now, I did not photograph them laughing because in my head, I'm like, this is not how you portray Africa as a general thing. This is not how you portray war. This is not how you portray poverty. I had this unconscious bias. Now I look at it and I'm like, now I would photograph them laughing. Now I would photograph them eating, laughing, joking. That's what I see. So I've learned to sort of battle that unconscious bias. And I guess that's the same with running an NGO, that people go into it with an unconscious bias of thinking, I think I know what's best for these people. I think I know what's best for this community. And as I've learned as a photographer, the first thing I needed to do was to sit and listen, sit and understand the stories. I have a rule that I would never photograph anyone if I haven't eaten with them first. So I always start by saying, let's cook together. Let's share a meal. And so the foundation was a kind of extension of that, where again, I just sat and was like, well, we have to listen, we have to learn, and then find ways to collaborate and work together on a project. So you're absolutely right. The storytelling is key to everything, but I had to learn how to be a storyteller. I had to learn how to break down my unconscious bias of how I represented people. And from that, I became what I would call an honest storyteller. I have said that I don't think there's such a thing as truth in photography, but there can be honesty. And what I mean by that is when I point a camera in a direction in a room and choose a fraction of a second to create an image, how is that the truth? That's 1 second of, a fraction of a second of somebody's life. You don't know when I point a camera, is there somebody behind me pointing a gun? Is there somebody behind me holding money, waving it in their hands? You don't know what's the context. So you have to trust the honesty of the photographer and the storyteller, but you can't accept it as truth. It's an interpretation of truth. And so, all these things helped to inform me so that when I said about foundation, I took all that knowledge, and storytelling was the core of everything that we do, because somebody's story is the most important thing that they have. And you have to respect the story. And then from the story, you learn how you can maybe support that person, that individual, or that community to rebuild their life.
And it gives you a natural starting point as well, right? So the Land for Women was something that just came out of a conversation. So you're leaving your work open enough so that when something does come across your path, you're able to act on it quickly.
Yeah. And I think I'm a problem solver. So, for me, it's always like, what's the solution? How is it that we can, and to be honest, it's heartbreaking because I suppose like a surgeon in triage, deciding which lives you can save. There are so many people I meet in so many situations in conflict that I can't do anything. I can't stop the war. I can't stop a building being blown up. I can't stop bombs falling. And there are some people I meet that are so injured, that have issues that I can't deal with. So I focus on the things that I can control and things that I can help, and then really try and do something about that. But it's hard because, there's 90% of the things I'm not capable or in a position to really have an impact. So, it comes from stories in the same way that somebody asked me, like, well, what are the photographs that affect you the most? And I said, the ones that affect me the most are the ones you haven't seen. Because inevitably, when I go and do a story, like I was talking about Olive in Rwanda, inevitably, there were a lot of other women that I met. And some of those stories didn't make the final edit or didn't make the piece that I wrote. Why? It's hard to tell. There's a number of reasons, but I see that as my failing because it's somebody who has an equally tragic, resilient story as Olive's, but for whatever reason didn't get published. Olive's story changed because we raised funds and we were able to do something. So I feel like I failed the ones that aren't there.
I was having a conversation with a photographer friend of mine recently, and just going back to that thing you said about truth, which I love that, quote from you. But what I think is beautiful about photography is that even though you're catching just that small glimpse of a moment, what I find most impactful about photographers or certain images is what's before and after that image, or almost my interpretation of that. So it's almost that the image itself is more of it's a glimpse into a story. And maybe what's not so beautiful is the image itself, but almost the bookends of that image, what you're thinking about before and after, you're thinking about that person. So do you think of it, photography, in that way when you do catch that glimpse of a moment?
It's interesting what you're saying. I hadn't actually thought about it in this context, but I was having a discussion last night with somebody about the belief that creativity comes out of restrictions. And the example I was using was, if you look at cinema in the 1920s and 1930s, if you wanted to make a horror film, you had to use sound, you had to use music, shadows, you had to build tension in other ways. Now you've got CGI, you can just create whatever you want. And so people don't put in so much effort in all the other things that go around it. Now, I would say those older films, they're more atmospheric, they make you more edgy and nervous. Now we can just visualize whatever monster, whatever creature we want to do and just make it happen. Maybe we've lost some of that. The restrictions that were there in early filmmaking meant people had to be creative in what they're doing. And maybe, what you're saying is kind of processing in my mind right now, but it's by allowing somebody to have that creativity of building a vision around that image, it makes them engage with it in a different way, in the same way that film, a documentary, kind of is telling you the before and after. It's like when you're on a bus or on a metro train, you see somebody opposite, you start building a story about them. You start imagining who they are. Maybe it's something inherent in humans that we want to do that. We want to build a narrative. Again, it could be dangerous with unconscious bias. Maybe it has challenges, but either way, it's instinctual. So a photograph allows you to do that. It gives you a basic palette, and then you can add color, you can add a narrative around it. I did a collection of my work a few years ago, and it was an exhibition, and we put it together as like a small book. And I'd laid out about 10 years of my work on the floor with my friend who was helping me edit. And there were about 100 and something photographs there. And I was looking at them, and I had this moment. I was like, well, most of these photographs were taken at 1/60th of a second or 125th of a second. And so when I saw 10 years of work, I realized that all those photographs added up to 1 second of light.
Wow.
So 10 years of my work actually was just 1 second. And that was really, really beautiful in a way, because it's what you're talking about, that, yeah, wow, how was I telling all these stories? So many stories, so many countries, so many conflicts, so many families, so many conversations, moments, meals shared, actually was there in just 1 second of light and time.
And that the contrast of those ideas, that an image, a photograph, in a lot of ways captures that moment that can be shown forever. But what you're mentioning and thinking about how it is just 1 second of life, it shows that ephemeral aspect that we all have to come to terms with.
Yeah, and that, you know, all these moments in our lives, they're actually, in a sense, we are living in those fractions of a second. You know, we have memories of the past, we have hopes and dreams of the future, but we actually live in fractions of a second. You know, that is where our life is, and everything else is memory or vision. And so actually, in a sense, a photograph does truly reflect life, because life is moments collected into a story. So when you take that moment, in that moment that it was captured, that was that person's life and reality. Everything else was imaginary, really. You know, memory is imagination. The future is imagination. We live in fractions of a second. And I think there's something quite beautiful and poetic about that. I was rereading, Paul Auster, the writer, passed away recently, and I was reading one of his short stories, which has the character that goes to the same spot every day to take a photograph. And he does it again and again and again because he lost his family, and it's kind of connected into that memory. But again, there's something really beautiful about that, of like the repetitive nature of just a moment each day. But yeah, they were all kind of fractions of a mosaic of life.
And I think that's what connects us to photographs as well, you know, because I have a different, situation than the subjects in your photos, but capturing that laughter or capturing that moment of grief, that is I think that's how we get connected to each other. So this person across the world, and I can't even imagine their situation, but you see a moment between a mom and a daughter, or you see a moment between a husband and wife, or two friends, or a moment of sadness. And that's really what binds us together. That fraction of a moment, of a second, is what creates the connection and the empathy for others.
It's funny as well. I mean, I really enjoy conversations like this because it makes you kind of actually analyze your own feelings about photography or work. And in many ways, memories are like photographs. When I look back at moments in my life, my parents are no longer with them. If I remember moments with my mum, it's not a movie. It's almost like a still image. It's like a moment. And it is those things of like holding someone's hand, an intimate moment with a partner that maybe you're no longer with, all those memories. And I think there's something in photographs that they should have gone out of fashion. They should have disappeared as soon as the moving image came. It should have become something that seems sterile and useless. And yet, when I talk to people about memories of past events, of historical events, they reference a photograph, not a clip of film. They'll often say, if they think about, say, the war in Vietnam or the war, the Iraq wars, Gulf wars, it will always be a photograph, not an image, like moving image. So there is something that humans relate to. And, I've been told many times that young people have got image fatigue now and they don't pay attention to images. I don't think that's true. Yes, they are bombarded with hundreds of thousands of images. But when you sit in a room with a bunch of 14, 15-year-olds and I'm showing them photographs and they have time to stop and look at that photograph, those kids will be in tears when you're telling the story and the connection with it. So I think the way we maybe access images has made it means that we spend less time on them, reflecting on them. But when you do take that time, it doesn't matter the generation. It doesn't matter how many images you've seen in your life. You will still have a moment of connecting with that story. And what you were mentioning about that shared humanity is really important to me. I'm not a war photographer in the sense of there's no pictures of tanks, explosions, people screaming in the streets, injured people when a bomb blast has just gone off. That's not my interest or focus. And I think we have to have that recorded. But I also think it's dangerous in that it creates a separation because there's no commonality in it. So when you see a picture of a car bomb that's just gone off in Baghdad and people screaming on the street, you look at that as something alien because you have no commonality. There's nothing you can share with that. But when you see a family in Baghdad sitting, having a cup of tea, laughing, one of the kids on the floor doing homework, the father sat with him doing sums, somebody cooking, somebody brushing someone's hair, you go, oh, wait a minute, that's like my family. That's like my life. And that's the shared humanity. So that's always been my focus is it doesn't matter whether you put me in a mud hut in South Sudan, a tent in Jordan, or, a flat in South London where I'm from. Within those four walls, you see exactly the same things. And as soon as you start to see that, then you can start to understand our connection and that shared humanity.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I meant by thinking of that image just as a still moment between these bookends or these different moments is that, and what I'm drawn to in your images is the fact that looking at this family, I know that on either end of that is destruction, but you've captured this moment of beauty that can connect to any person regardless of their situation.
It's kind of cliched, maybe not even cliched, maybe it's just naff to say, but I always say I photograph love, not war. And that really is the truth for me, that in those desperate situations, life is distilled down to its very basic elements. It's about survival, of getting food, shelter. But what you see is people reminded of how important the relationships they're close with are. And maybe we touched on it during COVID and lockdown, that people reevaluated what was important to them. So it wasn't necessarily about, I'm a chef as well. And I know people during lockdown, nobody was saying to me, I really miss this Michelin-starred restaurant, or I really miss going out and having scallops. They were like, I miss being with my family and eating together. I miss shared meals. So people maybe revalued that. And I think in a situation where people are in a conflict zone, a refugee camp, or some kind of natural disaster, when everything's taken away from them, they realize how important love is, their family, the people close to them. There's a photograph I did of a woman called Khulud who'd been paralyzed by a sniper, just lying on a bed, and her husband is there, sat on the end of the bed. And that was taken in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, and they were living in a homemade tent that they'd made themselves. It was a really desperate situation. And they're holding hands and just looking at each other. And I went back a couple of years later and I had a copy of the photograph that I'd taken. And I remember going through a really difficult moment in my life where I was like, I went back to visit them and they were still in the same tent. I was like, Jesus, I made a photograph and those photographs got published and aid agencies used it. What the hell's the point in my work if they're still in the same tent? And I was very unsure about giving them the photograph that I'd done 2 years before because I thought, look, it's just going to show them in the same terrible situation. But I gave it to them in the end. And when I gave it to Khulud, I said, when I made this photograph, it was not of a refugee. It was not of a woman with disability. It was a photograph of a couple in love. Mm. That's what I saw. And that's what that photograph is. And Jamal, the husband, he's lost everything in terms of a lot of family in Syria, his home, his business. And he's learned to say to me in English, because he says it so often, his greatest fear, and he'll whisper to me when he's cooking, he'll say, Giles, my greatest fear is that Khulud does not love me as much as I love her. Mm. And this guy has lost everything. He lives in a war zone. He lives in a refugee camp. He's now displaced. His greatest fear is his partner does not love him in the way that he loves her. And so that's when I see, and that's what I find. And that's the stories that I share. And it's actually a lesson to us all. I don't know if we took that lesson from COVID and lockdown, that the values that we resurfaced, the fact of sharing meals with family, all these things are important. I hope we learned some lessons, but I also feel like I learn a lot of lessons when I come back from some of these really difficult places to be, of what is important in life, what is the thing that if actually everything went to shit, your country's being destroyed, your homes are being bombed, what is the thing that you treasure? And I think we still get too caught up in unimportant things in our lives.
Of course.
That are distilled down in a crisis. And so, yeah, that's what I document.
The story you just told reminds me of a similar story I heard from Steve McCurry, who I'm sure you're familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
but he took that famous image of the little girl, and her bright eyes showing through her, the burqa or the headdress she was wearing. And the image captured the world. And he looked for that girl for, I believe it was about 30 years. And I apologize if you already know this story, but he did find her. And I think he was really moved in a sad way by how her life had kind of taken its toll. So he had an idea about the age that she probably was, and she looked, double that age just from the hardship she faced. And I think he was hoping that because of this image, her life had maybe gone a better way than it did. And she was in a broken situation, and it really broke his heart. But tell me about going back to the people in your images and how you think about that moment beforehand, and then maybe how you deal with the natural, disappointments, maybe to go back and see people in a hard situation.
So there's a couple of points to sort of unwrap there. One is I became very aware that as photographers, filmmakers, writers, we reference things like the story's finished or the project's done. And then thinking, well, that's really disrespectful to the people in it because it's not over. So if you photograph somebody living in a tent in a refugee camp like Khulud and Jamal, I can't come back and say I've done the story or I finished it, because they're living in that same situation. Their life has continued. So that story is continuing. And I remember when I wanted to go back and photograph Khulud and Jamal, I was actually doing a project for the United Nations, and they said, well, we've already done that story. And I was like, well, I want to go back and see what's happened. And they're like, well, we won't fund you to do that. So I took a break from the project I was on to go and do that story. And I've seen that again and again where people say to me, well, we've already done that story. We've already done it. You can't go back. So I will go back. And now I work very much independently. And it's really important for me to go back and tell stories and see what has changed or hasn't changed. Because part of displacement, especially in people who are refugees or internally displaced people, the thing is their lives are often in limbo. Nothing has changed. That is the story. The story is that nothing has changed. And so it's really important for me to keep going back. It's also important for me to understand that sometimes these things take time. So an example is a story I met a girl called Huala about 10 years ago. She was living in a refugee camp in Lebanon. She was Syrian. She was, I think, 11 years old at the time. Her school had been bombed in Syria, so she'd seen most of her schoolmates killed. Her father had been taken away. They don't know what happened to him. So she fled with her mother and two brothers who have disability. And she, when I met her, was living in this terrible sort of tent. And she'd taken rat poison because she wanted to kill herself because she'd heard her mother say she was struggling to feed everyone. And she thought if she killed herself, her brothers would get more food. And thankfully, she didn't die, but she was very sick for a long time. And she was incredibly vulnerable and frail. But she was also very playful, and she kept coming and wanting me to photograph her and tell her story. And I remember a couple of editors of magazines saying, wow, what a story, we should do that. I said, I can't interview her. It didn't feel right. And as a journalist, you're kind of told you're being weak then. You need to push it. You need to do it. I was like, well, no, because I still have to do what's right for me. So I actually interviewed her 6 years later. I waited until she was 18 and then did that interview. Now, a lot of people would tell me that was stupid and I missed out on the story being published or whatever, but I had to do what was right for me, and that takes time. What we did in the meantime is my foundation rehoused her and we supported her education. And so, I went and interviewed her when she graduated. And the story was very, very different. And as I say, it wouldn't get published because it wasn't dramatic and wasn't. But that's, for me, an example of how time is important. And then, sorry, I'm kind of reversing back to the original question. And you're talking about, going back and seeing people. That's also part of the early question of why I set up the foundation, because the Khulud and Jamal story of how I went back 2 years later and found them in the same tent is the moment I set up Legacy of War, because I said, I can't do this again. And maybe that's a sense of guilt. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. The point is, I said to myself, I can never go back and find nothing has changed. I have to take on that responsibility. So we did a crowdfunding campaign. We got the American actor Misha Collins involved. We spread the story of love, not of war, not of what happened in Syria. We didn't put politics into it. It was simply his family that love each other, that's in a terrible situation. How can we support them to rebuild their life? And we raised $250,000 in about 2 weeks.
Wow.
So we rehoused Khulud and Jamal and actually many, many other families, including Huala, who I was just telling you about. And over 10 years, we've seen those families grow. And actually, Khulud and Jamal now we managed to get them relocated to Holland. And that is really what, for me, was important, that I just couldn't be this photographer. And earlier I was talking about unconscious bias, but also that there was this old school idea that as a photographer, you're the fly on the wall and you're supposed to go there and not, it's a bit like when they talk about time travel, you're not supposed to touch anything because you destroy then the whole, chain of the future. And as a documentary photographer or filmmaker, you're supposed to go there and observe and don't interfere. And if something's happening, don't. And I call that out as bollocks now. I'm like, no, I can't be that person. We're an elephant in a room anyway. Some white guys walked into a tent, and pretending you're like, oh, I don't think they've noticed me. I mean, it's all bollocks anyway. But also, I am there because I don't want to win a Pulitzer. I don't want to be on the cover of New York Times. I'm there, as I said earlier, I'm an angry man with a camera. I see injustice in the world and I want to do something about it. And so for me, I could no longer make a photograph and walk away from that family without thinking, what did I actually do realistically to try and improve their situation? What did I try and do to help them rebuild their lives? And so I set up a foundation to do that. And so that was really the moment.
Welcome, seekers of wisdom and creativity. If the conversations here on Sissenek have stirred your inner depths and ignited the flames of inspiration, I invite you to venture further into the collective unconscious of our artistic community. By subscribing to our Substack channel, you will unlock extended dialogues that delve deeper into the rich tapestry of ideas shared by artists, designers, and creators. These extended versions of our conversations are akin to uncovering the hidden layers of the psyche, offering profound insights and revelations. In addition, you will gain access to exclusive question and answer sessions where the archetypes of the creativity reveal their mysteries, and guest articles that serve as guiding stars on your journey of self-discovery and creative expression. Embrace this opportunity to enrich your inner world and join us in this sacred gathering place. Subscribe today at sissenek.substack.com, and together let us explore the depths of the human soul through the lens of art and design.
Yeah, so the foundation also allowed you to go back to those stories, because if the classic media structure is we just want to send Giles to like whatever the hot place to be is right now to just get one or two stories every time, you'll never make it back. So it allowed you to be able to travel back and to visit the families that you've taken photographs of.
Exactly. And actually, I document their lives and knowing actually we kind of helped influence that or change that. And so if I go and photograph Khulud in Holland now, or Io is another girl I photographed in that particular project who now lives in France. Maybe that's, some people say, well, that's not true photojournalism, documentary photography, because you've interfered. I don't give a shit. As I say, I did it because I made a photograph. As you said at the beginning of this, it was about the storytelling element and the power of that. And I realized there was no point in saying to people, look, here's this shit situation. Here's this terrible story. And then saying, bye, I'm off now. It's not my job to deal with it. I wanted to give people a solution at the end of it, or something where people could actually engage. And we live in a very different world now. It's a very connected world. It's a world where people don't want to just send off, $50 to whatever organization. They want to help the people that they're seeing on TV or in a magazine or online. And I realized that it was a little bit selfish, a little bit wrong just to sort of do a story and not give people an out, not say this is what we can do. And it's not always about my foundation. Sometimes it'd be like, we need to do advocacy, or here's another organization, or you need to go out and protest about it, whatever it is. But you have to also give people something that they can do, because we live in a very overwhelming world in terms of the amount of shit going on. I don't know if it's better or worse. Somebody asked me this recently. I said, look, I don't know how you measure that. I was in Bosnia and Herzegovina last week, and it's the 30th anniversary of the genocide and the war there. This year is also the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. So 30 years ago, things were not, not going great. I think what's different is that now, by the time I even got out of bed, I've probably flipped through my phone and seen 5 genocides, 5 wars, 5 terrible incidents. I'm just seeing it constantly. And it then pushes people to think, I can't do anything about it. It's just too much. And that's the worst thing that can happen. So what I'm trying to do in my stories is use them like a keyhole and say, look, here's a family in Lebanon. Here's a family in Gaza. Here's a family in Ukraine, in Sudan. This is what they're going through. This is their shared humanity with us. This is why you should be able to relate to their story. And here's how we can help them. But when you help them, we're probably going to raise enough funds that we can help a lot of other families. But use that one particular story as a way to engage and have that shared humanity. And so that's where I found my purpose, is to break it down into something that's achievable, that's something that means we can, actually have a direct and positive impact.
And we can connect easier with one person or one family, as opposed to, it's hard for us to understand what 200,000 people are going through, or that doesn't, it's hard for us to grasp that. But if we know this certain family, and even if that family's situation is not exactly like everybody else's, we know that it encapsulates it, right? And so we can understand them from a person-to-person perspective.
Yeah, and as I say, it's then a keyhole, because exactly that, if I tell you, X amount of tens of thousands of people have been killed in whatever conflict, it's a number, and it's sort of overwhelming. We don't need to sort of necessarily go fully into it, but I was injured in Afghanistan when I was there. Spent a year in hospital. The really interesting part for me was about 3 months after my injury. I had lost both my legs, my arm. I was going through a huge acceptance of what had happened and trying to come to terms with it. And it was 3 months after my injury when I was well enough to be even moved out of intensive care into a chair to have a shower. And it was the first time I saw myself. And I was like shocked. It was a moment of, up to then I've been trying to stay alive. Now I had to come to terms with this new reality. I was, a man living with disability, all the freedoms and things I'd taken for granted. I was 40 years old. I was starting life again. And I was overwhelmed by it. And I remember thinking, I wished I'd just actually died in Afghanistan where I got injured, and I couldn't cope with this new reality. And I went to bed after the shower and I cried myself to sleep. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't want to speak to anyone. But the next day I woke up and my kind of natural stubbornness had kicked in. And I woke up the next day and I said, from this moment on, I will never think about things I can't do, but I will focus on what I can and excel at that. And that mantra has stuck with me ever since. And every day I repeat it to myself. And every subject I look at, I go, that's how I need to deal with it. If I was to ask most people, listening to this interview, what's the thing bothering you the most? 80 to 90% of them will reply with something they have no control over. They will say, look, it's what's happening in Gaza, it's what's happening in Ukraine, it's the effects of COVID, it's, all these different factors, it's the elections, things that they have no control over. And those overwhelm you because as humans, when you feel powerless, you become insular and you think, I can't do anything about it. And my answer is, you're right. You can't do anything about it. But you can do something on a small scale. So maybe you can get some wheelchairs to one of these crises. Maybe you can help one family. And so those big things that we have no control over have to be in the periphery of our vision. They have to inform us. We have to be educated about them. But if they're there in front of you, they block your vision to opportunity. And so I'm always saying to people, be aware of the things you can't control, but don't let them dominate your thinking. And so each day for me, I wish I could stop the wars that I'm documenting. I wish I could stop my friends from dying in these places. I can't. But I can do something. Whether that be me thinking, I can get a new ambulance to the front lines. I can help set up another farm for women. I can do something that day and focus on that. So as I say, that was the big life lesson. I went through something so traumatic. I got blown up in Afghanistan when I was there working as a photographer. I barely survived, spent 46 days in intensive care, went through a year of 37 operations. It was a living hell. But I came out with it with that one clarity of vision. And that was that I would always think about the things I could do, not what I couldn't. Always work on the things I can control, not the things outside of my control.
It's, I think, such an important aspect of being an artist, and maybe what I think most artists have to come to terms with is, because what we're doing is we're trying to take this thing that isn't physical and kind of give it a physical nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the most important things you can learn is that you have to keep your palms open. Like, it's almost, I can only control so much, but the rest of it is just something that I have to come to grips with. And that, I think, is such an important part of the process, especially for you, because you're, it's not just an idea, right? Like, this is something where you're in the worst parts of the world at that particular moment, and there's just so much that you can't do. But there is something that you can do, and focusing on that while keeping your palms open, is this really difficult dichotomy to wrestle with.
I think it's interesting. I started as a fashion photographer and music photographer. At 19, I got a camera. I was very lucky. I never assisted. I started getting cool shoots. I spent 10 years doing that, as we would say, blagging my way through it. I had no idea what I was doing, but I had to talk and created some kind of cool images that got me work. But I was always feeling something was lacking in my life. Like, I didn't really, and I wasn't an artist then. I was a commercial photographer. And when I kind of hit about 30, and that was about the time of post 9/11. So I was seeing all these conflicts in Afghanistan and then Iraq. And I was curious. I wanted to know more what was going on. And I felt powerless. I felt overwhelmed. Like, what the hell can I do? I'm shooting for Vogue. I'm doing, hanging out with Oasis. How am I going to use those skills to have any impact in the world? And then I thought, well, okay, the one thing I am is a storyteller. And the one thing I can do is create an image that people will look at. I know I can do that for a magazine. I know how to create a good editorial image. And I was like, well, that's going to be my focus. And people say, well, you can't change the world with a photograph. And I said, no, but maybe I can inspire the person that can. Maybe that's my role. And I really believe that. People come to talks and they go like, well, what can I do? And I'm like, well, you tell me what you can do, because each one of us has a skill. Each one of us has something we can do, whether it be in our business, our community, or on a more global scale. And we use the skill that we have. I wish I was a politician or a surgeon or a millionaire or billionaire these days, but could actually do something directly on the ground. I can't, but I can tell a story, and maybe one of those people will see it. And it's really moving sometimes to hear the impact a photograph can have. I had a letter a few years ago from a guy in Australia, and he wrote me, it was like, "Dear Mr. Duley, I just wanted to let you know that I got into Brisbane Medical School." And I was like, "Okay, great. Who the hell are you?" I started rereading a bit more. And he talked about that he'd struggled at school, that maybe he wasn't the most academic and he had problems at home. But he said, "I had a photograph that you'd taken in Afghanistan on my wall. I'd look at that every day to remind me why I wanted to do this path and why I wanted to be a doctor." And he goes, and it gave me strength. And he goes, "And thanks to you, I got a scholarship and I'm there studying." Wow. And I thought, wow, that is just everything I set out to do. Is, none of us know the impact of our actions, but every action we have is like when you throw a pebble in a pool and there's ripples. And we have to make a choice. Do you want those ripples to be negative or positive? And do you want those ripples of your actions to inspire or encourage or support others to do something similar? And that's what I want to do. And, in many ways, if I retired straight after that letter, the knowledge that somebody maybe had become a doctor or had found their purpose in life because of one of my images kind of makes it all worthwhile. And so that's, I think, for me, and everyone has their interpretation of what is an artist. An artist, for me, was about expressing how I saw the world. It was how I interpreted the chaos that is the world, how I found my own clarity in the storytelling. So yes, I'm telling the stories of people in conflict. I'm telling the stories of people rebuilding their lives, but I'm also telling you how I see the world. And I'm also telling you that I actually feel, as somebody that's seen the worst in humanity, I'm an optimist, and I see love, and I see hope, and I see resilience. So that is when I went from being a commercial photographer to being an artist, because I was not just showing you what I'd seen, but I was also through the lens of my experience in life. And I think that's truly what art is expressing your feelings about how you have interpreted the world around you.
And that's why I think art is so important, and why I think you need to have a purpose in what you're doing. Because when you get low or you get discouraged, and it's like, gosh, what can I do? Like, in my case, I'm making jackets and stuff, or in your case, you're taking photographs, but there's something, I think, spiritual or something that we don't even understand about art, but it just connects people in such a different way. There's something in another dimension that's happening, and that's why we do what we do, and why it's important to have an idea or a belief in what you're doing, because it can inspire, the next generation of leaders who may be doing something physical that helps people.
Yeah, and I've had to relearn and unlearn a lot of things myself, because I think, mainly I'm talking about the West, the kind of commercialization of art, and also that we see everything only has value if it makes money. I have a lot of friends that were like playing music when they were younger or creative, and they stopped it. And it's almost because, but it wasn't my job. It wasn't what I was earning money for. It's a luxury to sort of be a painter or a musician if it's not your career. And that's really sad. And I see in a lot of the situations I go, and with my foundation, one of the things we do a lot of is art therapy, and how children painting and drawing is a way for them to deal with their trauma. So you realize how intrinsic it is in our even understanding of ourselves and our ways of expressing trauma. But we live in a world that's so caught up in success means, earning money from something. So as a photographer, I've tried to relearn the difference between purpose and goals. And what I mean by that is when we're young, and I'm talking like school age, if somebody says to you, what do you want to be in the future? You'll say something like, I want to be a fireman because I want to save lives. I want to be a nurse because I want to heal people. I want to be a scientist because I want to cure cancer. And for me, I wanted to be a photographer. But then you start setting goals that you think will help you achieve that purpose. So for me as a photographer, I was like, well, I want to shoot for GQ and Vogue, and I want to do big campaigns because that will give me freedom to be an artist. Then you become so caught up in the goal, you forget the purpose. You forget why you did it in the first place. When I picked up a camera, it's not because I wanted to make a load of money. I didn't pick up a camera because I wanted to be on the cover of New York Times or American Vogue. I picked it up because I'm dyslexic. I can't write very well. I got held back at school. I picked up a camera because suddenly I could talk, I could communicate, I could express my feelings. But I got caught up in this world in my 20s where if I wasn't shooting for Vogue, I thought I was a failure. I thought I was constantly looking at like the most successful photographers in the world and comparing myself to them and going, God, you're shit because you're not like them. And everything was about getting big campaigns, how much money I was going to get paid. And then I stepped back. And when I started doing the documentary work, I was like, why did I want to make photographs? I didn't make it because I wanted to be in Vogue or GQ. I didn't want to do a Prada campaign. That wasn't my goal. It was because I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to connect with people. And so even today, I work in a very different way to photojournalism or most photographers. I don't do commissions. I don't work for magazines or newspapers. I still have moments where it's like that weird thing of like you've rejected a world and then you feel upset that they've rejected you. And I'm like, why don't I win awards? Why don't I do it? I know I won't. It's not that kind of work, but there's still moments where I'm like, maybe that means I'm not a good photographer. Maybe it means I'm not, because my work's not in all these magazines. But then I look at it and I go, yeah, but I look at the families. Their lives have changed. I look at the millions we've raised through the foundation because of those photographs and stories. And I'm like, that's why I set out to do it. But even in that position, I still have moments of self-doubt in myself as an artist put on me because of the social norms and constraints of artist means success, means making money, means being in whatever publication. For you, it's like, oh, unless you're doing a Paris, catwalk, or you're not doing, or your jackets are not in GQ magazine, I failed. And actually you go, no, that's not why we did it. We did it because we wanted to create. And that is the core of it. And yes, those goals are wonderful and good luck to anyone that achieves them. But that's not why any of us became artists. And unfortunately, we live in a society that celebrates the artist that makes the most money, that celebrates the artist that sells the most albums, and not looking at actually how does that content impact us? How does that content improve us as a society, as humans?
And it's just natural because you're a human that you get back to that point every once in a while. I know for me, I was making things. I started making things at, 18 with like graphic printed t-shirts and then kind of found out about, cut and sew by my travels to India and like this other things. But I, for so long, for about 10 years, I did everything I could to quote unquote make it, and it was, when I look back, there was a purity to it because I wanted people to enjoy what I was doing. Mm-hmm. So, I wasn't really going into fashion to make a bunch of money or whatever. And I tell people like, you don't want to go into fashion if you're trying to make money. A few people can really do well, of course, as in everything, but I wanted so bad to make it happen. And the crazy part of it is in my, one of my most discouraging moments when I was like, it's possible this could never happen, whatever that kind of moment I visualized. And I said to myself, okay, Drew, if you're still making stuff at 80 years old and it never gets past, your guest bedroom, are you okay with that? And I had to come to terms with like, that could be what happens, But ultimately I said, yes, I'm fine with that. And weirdly enough, when I let go of what I thought was supposed to happen, that's actually when I think I found what became my voice, or, that process of finding my voice in that moment, because I let go of like, what's this person going to like? I should kind of make something like this. What's popular now? Like maybe I can make a version of that. I let go of that expectation. And that's actually when things started to happen, because I think, I have trouble with the word authenticity, but I think there's, letting go is actually what kind of helped things start moving along.
I think there's a weird correlation between the artistic temperament and desire to create that also comes with insecurity and a need for approval. And it's sort of funny how, some of the most creative people I know who are kind of very independent, they're the kind of people not doing mainstream music or art, they also desperately want approval from the mainstream. And they may not even, openly admit it, but I think there is this strange, sort of dichotomy of the creative who is the maverick, the independent, doing their own thing, not fitting into society. Also, often is the person that feels most rejected by society and doesn't feel their place. And so you have to try and find that balance of needing your art to be appreciated by somebody else, because it's your communication. And if it's rejected by everybody, you feel like I'm not communicating. And at the same time, holding on to that integrity, authenticity of doing it the way you want to do it, not because you're trying to please someone else.
Well, I think as an artist, there's a natural sensitivity that we have, because being an artist is not just like seeing a few different things and collaging it together to make something new. You have to dive so deep into the interior of your being, of your beliefs, and I think that the negative side of that is that you're sensitive, and what that can look like is creating a soft protection over yourself, so when these other things start bombarding you, you haven't built up this protection against the world. And so you start caring about like what Vogue says and what, who's getting the awards. And
and I think as well, we live in a society that a lot of art now is done by committee, is done by survey, is done by what is going to appeal to the biggest number of people. That's what commercial art is, whether it be music, film, photography. Is how are we going to make something that appeals to the most amount of people? Because that's how we make the most money. That's how we get the biggest reach. And that creates banality and non-controversial art. And so for being a maverick and a truly authentic artist, you are going to probably have a lot of people that really don't like it and a few people that really connect with it. But that goes against the commercial model. And that's why, unfortunately, I think a lot of creativity is quite insipid at the moment. We're going through such huge times, not just globally in terms of conflict, environmental, but also, political in most countries at the moment. It's going through big transitions. And yet, where's the art fighting that? Where's the music? Where's the protest in art? Very little of it, because that upsets people. So let's put banality out. Let's put things out that's not going to offend. I remember reading a book by, I don't know how to say this, I'm not an educated man. So Sidney Lumet, the filmmaker, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, but he was talking about how during his career, there's a great biography about making movies, but he talks about later in his career, he made these kind of amazing films, which were, auteur films, where it's his vision. By the end of his career, he was having to do samples where you get audience in, they'd watch the end of the film and they'd go, hey, we don't really like that ending. And then they would change it to make everyone happy. But then he looked into it, and I think he did his own surveys and certainly his own research, where he took some of the greatest films made, the most popular films, like Casablanca, for example, and asked people, did you like the ending? And they're like, no. And he realized that people often, they didn't like the ending, but that's what kept it with them. That's what broke their heart. That's what made them walk away going, oh my God, I can't believe they didn't get together, or that person died. But if you ask them and then just do what they've asked you, you're going to make an insipid end that nobody remembers. So, he really proved that point. And by creating art where you don't want to offend anyone, or you want to get the most people liking it, or it's not going to cause any divisions, you end up with something insipid, but it doesn't inspire. It doesn't lead people. Art should make some people angry. Art should upset some people. Art should make some people walk away going, no, you're completely wrong. But that's great, because that's what is starting debate. That's what's starting to make people question their own assumptions about life.
But I think that only happens as an artist when you're thinking about the long game, because we have so much short-term dopamine that we chase every day. And that's what is great on Instagram. In my world, it's the brands who do well are the ones who make, the most insane shoe that goes viral on social media, But one of my creative heroes is the filmmaker David Lynch, and he talks always about having final cut, always being the one to make the creative decisions. And his cult film Eraserhead, you can go on to YouTube and you can see the reaction. Somebody filmed people walking out from Eraserhead in 1972 or whenever it came out. And they were like, that's the most horrible movie I've ever seen, except that Eraserhead became Stanley Kubrick's favorite film. And now here we are, decades later, people still talk about it, And so as an artist, you have to have
Absolutely.
that belief in your ability and your discernment, which I want to ask you about discernment, but you have to trust that process, and that's not going to come out in the short-term success.
There's one of the things I love to do with my foundation and as a photographer is connecting people. And, that may be of no advantage to me, but I meet somebody and then years later you meet somebody else and you're like, oh my God, I know who you should speak to because you two would relate to. And I actually, there's a David Lynch story. My favorite David Lynch story is about that his ability to keep in his mind ideas and people. And so when he made Eraserhead, there's a woman in there who has a sort of minor role, and she relates about how they were sat having, of course, coffee and cherry pie after filming. And he looked at her and he said, whenever I sit with you, I imagine you carrying a log. She hadn't spoken to him again. They were students together. 20 odd years later, she gets a phone call saying, I need you as the log lady in Twin Peaks.
Of course.
I'm like, how does a mind work like that? That he kind of put that away somewhere in a cabinet in his mind, that person was the log lady. Not even the fact that he would then think of it as a character and forget the woman. No, he knew who that person had to be. And he got back in contact and there was the log lady. And I've always loved that story. And I try and do that myself where, I meet people and try and log them in my mind about how at some point I hope I can be of use to them by connecting them to somebody else, finding that right partnership or a project. Sometimes I meet people and they say, we should collaborate. And I can't see any way we can. And then years later, I'm like, hold on a minute, this is the project. Get back in contact with them. But yeah, I love that David Lynch story about the log lady, that he kept that in his mind all that time.
Wow. And that character in Twin Peaks ended up being, even though, she doesn't show up that much, she's like one of the foundational elements of the story, which is fascinating. I want to know about, as I mentioned, discernment, and going back to that story that you told about not wanting to interview the little girl who had, tried to poison herself. Discernment is such a important part of the artistic process, because part of my love for somebody's work, like yourself, is that trust that I have in you, because I'm trusting you that you did all the work to distill this story into a single image or 5 images. So tell me about discernment, how you use it, and where did you learn that trait?
So there's a couple of kind of different answers to that. One is, with the work I'm doing, this a simple moral question. Is this morally right in my own mind? I don't really care about people giving me lists of requirements and what legally you can do. It's morally. And there are times when I just feel morally that this is not the photograph I should be doing. There's a moment even when you're in a hospital where people have been injured, where somebody will look at you and I'll just put my camera away because I'm like, and another time people will look at you, and I've seen this with people even dying, where there's a tacit kind of sense of record this, it's important. That then leads on to the next bit. When somebody trusts me with their story, when somebody allows me to photograph them in their worst moment, and I should say as well, I was actually photographed about 5 minutes after I got blown up in Afghanistan. So I've had somebody point a camera at me when I've just had my legs blown off, my arm blown off, and I'm dying. So I kind of have a bit of a, I've been on the other side quite literally, so I have some understanding of that. But when somebody trusts me in a refugee camp to come into their tent, be with their family, allow me to photograph their intimacies, they're not doing it because they want to be on the New York Times. They're not doing it because they want to win a Pulitzer. They're not doing it because they want their photograph on CNN. They believe it's going to either help them in their community, or on a wider scale, it's going to let people know what's happening in the world and this should not be happening. That's why they're doing it. And so I would say that when you photograph somebody in their worst moment, it comes with great responsibility. What's the purpose? Why have you made that photograph? Did you make it because you want to win a Pulitzer? Did you make it because you want to get praise? If so, you have to start questioning your own morals. So for me, I feel myself a guardian of someone's story. They have entrusted me because they want something to happen. They don't care about how much it sells for. They don't care its commercial uses. They're doing it because they hope it will either help them or help on a wider scale. So that's one really important part of why and how I'm morally approaching photographs. I have a rule that I share with photographers that I mentor or people that ask me for advice. And this may sound really banal, but often the best advice is the simplest with clarity. And I call it my sister rule. I'm very close to my sister. She's a little bit older than me, but I'm very protective of her. And I always ask people, if you're making a photograph of somebody in a distressing moment, if that was your sister in that image, would you be okay with it? And why would you photograph anyone that you wouldn't be happy, somebody photographing your sister or whoever you love in that way? Show them the respect you would want somebody to show your sister. Show the dignity that you'd want somebody to show your loved one in that moment. And it's amazing how many people say to me, God, I photograph people in a way that I wouldn't have wanted to see somebody I love. I'm like, well, there you go. Rethink it. I hear people sometimes say to me, they go, how do you get all those hospital photographs in Afghanistan and Iraq? I tried to go in the hospital and they wouldn't let me. I'm like, you wouldn't walk into New York hospital with a camera and start pointing it and taking photographs of people? Why do you expect you can do it somewhere else? Treat people with the same respect and dignity you would expect your loved ones to be treated. So that's another aspect for me in how I'm discerning what images I'm going to make. And then the third thing is purpose. When I started photography, and I think a lot of photographers do it, we just like making photographs. I like the light. I like an image. I didn't really think it through. I just liked doing it. It felt good. It was a way of communicating, but I just wanted to create pictures that I liked to look at. Once you start going into becoming an artist or documentary photographer, or creating this kind of stuff we're talking about, it now comes with the question of why did you make that photograph? And so again, when I'm mentoring photographers, I'll be like, let's work it back sometimes. Why did you go to Afghanistan to photograph in a hospital? Were you doing it because you wanted to create images for people to look at? That's not enough. That's not reason. Why is your outcome you want it to be in the New York Times and raise more awareness? Is it because you want it to be shown in the Houses of Parliament or in Congress or in the United Nations as advocacy? Is it because you actually want to use this as evidence in a war crimes trial at some point? What is it that you are trying to do? And work back from that. That is really important to me now, so that when I'm making a photograph, I have already worked back. What am I wanting this to achieve? How is it helping the person I'm photographing or the community? What is it they want from it? Again, how many photographers sit down with the community and say, look, I'm here as a storyteller. What's the story you want and who do you want to hear it?
Right.
It's a really simple thing, but I always do that and just sit down and go, like, what is it that you want to? And it's one of the reasons, I know it can sound like a pretense to say I'm a storyteller, not a photographer, but one of the reasons I use that phrase is because a lot of the communities that I go to, they don't really understand what a photojournalist is or documentary photographer. It's not a concept they understand. Storytelling is, and storytelling is intrinsic in communities for all sorts of reasons. It's something that can bring comfort to people. It can bring wisdom. It can bring advice. It can warn you against things. It can be a way to communicate your story to another community. And so, to sit down in the same way I said I do with Legacy of War Foundation, I sit down and go, look, I'm here. I'm a storyteller. I'm here to share your story. Two things. What is the story you think is most important? And secondly, who do you want to hear it? So right. That is what, at the end of the day, defines how I'm choosing the imagery, the things I'm trying to do is what is the purpose in it?
And so some of the discernment, and correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the discernment is coming through the teamwork really that you have with the subject. There's almost a way that you approach something 50% and then they approach you 50% to make something work. And so the discernment in an idea or a subject comes because there's this understanding that we're moving forward with one goal.
Yeah, because as I said, people are sharing their worst moment because they want something positive to come out of it or something people to know. And it's interesting as well. There is a sense as well of people want to be heard, and often in conflicts, natural disasters, or kind of other situations, people feel unheard. And even people's own trauma, often when there is shared trauma, when people, whole society, community have gone through something, people don't see the validity in their own trauma because they'll always tell you somebody's had it worse. So they're not going to say to their neighbors, look, I'm really terrified because our house got bombed yesterday, when they know their neighbor lost their husband or children or partner, whatever it is. So people tend not to share their trauma that if it was individual, they would share with everyone, or might want to share with everyone, or could share with everyone. But when it's shared, feel that it's not valid. So often when I sit with people and they just share their story, I get a kind of thank you afterwards. Mm-hmm. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing my story. I know in my own experiences, my own traumas, often I've just needed to tell somebody and know that they're listening. And that's really helped me. So almost that's part of the process. And then, working with them to say, okay, how do you want this to share? What is it you hope to achieve? Because you've just shared something very intimate with me. And I want to know why and what we're going to do with that and how that could possibly be. I also don't promise anything. I never sit there going like, oh, if you do this, we'll make sure that you get money for your community, or we rebuild the schools, or whatever it is. I have no promises. I always say, look, I have no idea. And so the chances are nothing will happen with this. But in the ideal situation, and one of the things that actually gets told a lot to me is we want the leaders of the world to hear this. We want the politicians or the people that decide. So, again, I've had exhibitions in the Houses of Parliament in the United Kingdom and in the lobby where I know MPs and politicians are seeing it. I don't necessarily think it changes anything, but that's often when I felt the most satisfied because I feel I did what I was asked to do. When I was a fashion photographer, a music photographer was about my ego. It was about me and the ego of the band, whoever I was photographing. Now I've tried to take my ego out of it. I'm still learning to do that. But I see myself as a guardian of somebody else's story, a mirror reflecting their experience. I hate that phrase that gets used a lot. And sometimes when I'm doing talks and I'm introduced, people say it, they go like, oh, Giles Duley gives voice to the voiceless. Mm. I'm like, I don't. They have voices. You just haven't heard them. I am simply amplifying their voices. I'm lucky that I have a platform, that I have a skill as a storyteller, but I give nobody a voice. I am simply there to make sure that we hear the voices of the unheard.
Yeah, and it goes back to that empowerment thing you said near the beginning, which, it's easy for people to come up with these catchphrases that are really snappy and sound cool. But yeah, that totally makes sense what you're saying. I would love to know about those 10 years that you spent as a fashion photographer, traveling the world with bands and celebrities. And what I would like to know is what you learned. I mean, you said that you've had to unlearn a lot of the work that you did, or the way that you worked, rather, after those 10 years. But how has some of those things that you did learn, those first 10 years of doing that work, that you've been able to bring with you into, the areas of conflict?
I think it was a really good process for me learning editorial photography. Two things specifically. One is I would look at magazines before I worked in that world and think, oh, I could do a better photograph than that. But what I didn't realize is, you turn up at somebody's hotel room, they don't want to go out. They're just like, you got 5 minutes, make a photograph. The pressures of having to perform. And I think that's, the difference between an amateur, maybe, and a professional in all sorts of aspects, whether it be as a chef, as a photographer, as a designer, is everybody can get lucky once in a while. And you can make, like, maybe as a cook at home, you can make some good food, but to churn out 40, 50 meals every night of the same quality, relentlessly of the same thing, is a skill. And likewise, as a photographer, you can make a great photograph. You can be a really keen amateur photographer and take some great images. But when you're told to do it and it's a wet, rainy morning, you have a band that doesn't want to be photographed. They're hungover. One of them's missing. All these different pressures. You're like, okay, there's a whole other aspect. So it taught me to be able to perform as a creative, even if I didn't feel it. I might have a hangover. I might be the one that doesn't want to do it. But you have to do that. So that was a really good skill. But then the other one was simply learning about magazines and design, things like where the gutter goes in the magazine, where the text is going to go, seeing it from the side of the art director, as opposed to maybe a lot of documentary photographers are just not seeing it that way. So I had a kind of editorial background, a commercial background, which helped me to say, well, look, at the end of the day, the first thing I also need to do in any images that I'm doing is make sure people see it, make sure it's published, make sure it's accessible to people. And so being an editorial photographer for 10 years had taught me that discipline of being able to turn up in any situation, create an image, but also think about how the layout would be used in that image. What would it be best in terms of how it could be used functionally. So that commercial element, I think, was really useful in making my pictures accessible and usable.
Do you find that there's a connection point or a similarity between that moment, and I guess I'm thinking about it as you're in the hotel room with Oasis and you have 5 minutes to shoot them. They don't really want to be there. And then these other moments you've experienced, which is you're in the hospital watching somebody go through surgery. They also maybe don't want you to be there. There's a connection that as humans we're seeking between each other. And maybe, Giles, is there something you learned about connecting with people in quick moments like that where you had to do a job, I guess, that are similar between, a band that's world famous and a person who's in the roughest moment of their life?
Well, I think one of the things for me was about respecting people and photographing them in the same way. It didn't matter whether they were, a world famous band or somebody I just met who was living in a refugee camp. So one of the devices I use a lot is a white bed sheet, which I hang up and do portraits against this white sheet, which is something I used to do when I was doing music photography. A kind of very simple sort of Avedon sort of style of daylight, white background. And I started to use that when I was photographing people in refugee camps or conflict areas, because it took them out of the environment. Because as soon as, you put somebody and they're stood next to a tent, and you already kind of created an image of who that person is. And I remember like photographing early on in my career, actually it was in Lebanon, and people saying, oh, we don't want to be photographed here. And me just thinking, oh, they don't want to be, whatever reasons, cultural or whatever. And then realizing actually a lot of times it was because they were embarrassed. They were like, this is not our home, and we can't tidy, we can't do anything. And so I said, well, how about if I do a portrait against this white background and photograph you as if, I was doing an editorial, and people would be like, yeah, we'd love to do that, because it was giving them a certain dignity back. And so that sense of, yes, anybody I photograph is equal to me. Everybody is the same. It doesn't matter who you are. I'm going to put that same care and attention as I would if I was doing a cover shoot for GQ magazine. Of course, that's instinctual for me. I wouldn't see that any differently. So, yeah, I don't really see any difference for me about who's in front of the camera and what I'm doing. But I do think years of doing the editorial photography taught me discipline and skills that meant that I could do that. But I'm luckier now because actually, doing the music photography often was really big time pressures. And now it's funny because I do some editorial again, and it's not really editorial, but it's things maybe where people want me to do a photograph of somebody. And now I'm just like, oh, shut the fuck up. It's like, and people also treat me differently because they struggle to maybe have some of the airs and graces that a celebrity might have when they know my story and where I've been working. And I like it. It changes the dynamic a lot. But getting back to the way I work now, I don't make many photographs. And I spend a lot more time observing, watching, getting to know people, sharing a meal. And so if it's, you use the example of a hospital, but I remember doing something in Afghanistan a couple of years ago, just at the time when Kabul was falling and the whole terrible evacuation mess happened. But I was in this hospital and, I would see things happening because hospitals tend to have a rhythm. In fact, most life has a rhythm. People in homes, in their houses, everyone has a rhythm of life. And you sort of watch it and you go, okay, I know that about 11:30 and they tend to bring people past this bit and the light looks really great here. If I sit over there tomorrow, I'm going to be in a perfect position for the photograph I want. And so I'm lucky now that I work in a completely opposite way to the editorial, where I will always spend my time observing, seeing things, and then go back with my camera and make a photograph. So if you took me back to my 20s and you said I have an hour to photograph someone, I would be all set up, ready to go, be shooting for the moment I met them. Now I would spend 50 minutes talking to them and 10 minutes making a photograph.
Yeah, because the connection you have with that person, it's almost that there's a emotional connection now that you have with somebody after you've eaten food with them, after you've spent time at their home playing with their kids. And that, I think, can come out in an image, right? I mean, even though you're just capturing that moment, there's a comfortability between you. There's trust between you.
The really good portrait photographers and fashion photographers that I learned from is their ability to connect with someone. And so some of the most iconic imagery of fashion and music and actors is a white background. And somebody, I can think of like beautiful Kate Moss shoots where it's a white background and she's just looking at the camera, Calvin Klein campaigns that she did. The photography is so simple, but you feel a connection and people will remember that image. And it's the greatest skill because there's nowhere to hide when you just got a white background and you're shooting black and white and it's all sort of simple like that. There's nowhere to hide. And so for me, the only thing that makes that picture strong, and actually you can't even describe it. I'm trying to think what the words are. I can see a shitty picture of somebody against a white background. It's so boring. And then I'll see an Avedon one where I'm like, wow, I could look at that picture for days. The only difference is the connection. It's very hard to vocalize what that difference is. If somebody said it described the two differences to an alien, you would struggle because they look the same. But one of them will make you feel something. One of them will just be boring. And I describe it, the feeling you get when you're on a date with someone. And you'll be sitting there having a dinner with somebody you just met, maybe you asked them out. And then there's a moment when you just connect with each other. And they look at you in a certain way, you look at them in a certain way, suddenly everything else in that room disappears. And there's a moment when you kind of go, okay, this is going well. There's something here. And weirdly, it's like that when you're doing a portrait. There's just a moment where you connect with someone where the rest of the world disappears. And maybe it's trust. Maybe it's they open up. But there's just a moment where you connect. And I believe you see that in a photograph. And I think the really great photographers have an ability beyond the technical to connect with people. And I've been lucky enough to meet a lot of my favorite photographers, and they are very special people in whatever way, but you connect with them. And it allows you an intimacy, and intimacy comes from trust.
And so when you're looking at your own work, Giles, and you're coming up with, I know you have to cut back so many of the stories that you want to tell, you're not able to share on the level you'd like to share them. So when you're boiling it down, what is it about the images that you choose that made you choose them versus, I'm sure, dozens or hundreds of other great images?
I have to go back to what we talked about, why you make a photograph and the purpose. And I have to be quite cold about it. I have to see it outside of my own interaction, because sometimes the photograph that's you spent weeks trying to build up a relationship, weeks trying to get the right setting, the hardest photograph to get. Sometimes you have to look at it and go like, it's not a great photograph. It's not a great image. And then another time you'll take a photograph at the last minute and just snap it. And then you think, I didn't really work hard on that. It's not really got any value. But you go, actually, it's a really great image. And what is a great image? Well, in my context, a great image is one that I think the viewer is going to connect with. So I have to look at the stories and the photographs and try and see it abstractly from the viewer's perspective and think, which is the photograph that somebody's going to look at this and see that shared humanity? Which is the photograph they're going to look at this and relate to the person in that image as if they were a family member or a friend? What is the image that is going to give some insight into that story? And so I have to choose it from that perspective. And it's just a reality. There are some people that you meet that can tell their story in a certain way. They'll use a certain phrase or a certain look or something about them that makes them relatable, that makes them likable, makes them able for people to connect. And sometimes I beat myself up about that. And I think, am I just being selective? Why am I doing it this way? But I'm doing my job. And my job is to try and get these stories out. And so I have to create stories that I think the viewer and the reader will connect with. And I have to remind myself that these stories are just the keyhole that I hope will introduce people into the wider context of what we're talking about. So, it can seem almost immoral to sort of sit here and talk about, like, in the middle of a war zone, I'm trying to find somebody that's got an interesting way of telling their story or connect with someone, but that's the reality. And, I have so when I go on to visit an organization, an NGO in the field, they will know I'm coming and they'll arrange the visit and for me to meet various beneficiaries. And I've been doing this for a long time and I've changed the way I've worked. What used to happen is I would turn up and the local teams would have made a list for people for me to meet. And let's say we're talking with an organization that's doing, in this example, dealing with disability and injury. And they would make me a list of people they think I should meet. And I would look at this list and it would normally be a list of their injuries. It'd be like, so-and-so has a facial injury, so-and-so has lost an arm. And at first, I was an outsider and I'd, visit these people. Now what I do is I get the whole team together, they'll give me the sheet and I'll rip it up. And this normally upsets people because they put a lot of time and effort in connecting with people and they say, look, we've spoken to these people, they're keen to do it, and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I don't want a list of injuries. You've given me a list of injuries. And I said, let's start again. And I'll say, okay, tell me about, and I should say as well, they normally give me a list of like the worst injuries, the most horrific cases. And I'll say, well, let's start again. You are the local teams. You're the physiotherapists, the surgeons, the doctors, nurses, dealing with these people every day. Tell me the family, wherever you go there, they have the naughtiest kid that always makes you laugh. And they'll go, oh my God, they all look at each other and they always have one immediately. They go, oh yeah, so I said, write that one down. Okay, who is the place where you go where the family insists you eat with them and you always get the most amazing food and everyone goes, oh yeah, this one, write it down. Where is the family when you go home at night, it keeps you awake because you wish you could do something more for them? And there's something about them, and they'll write it down. I guarantee that list will be completely different to the list they first gave me. And it's a difference between a narrative and a story. And a narrative is like what happened to you. So, for example, for me, my narrative is I got blown up in Afghanistan in February 2011. I'm out with American troops. We get ambushed. I step on an IED. I'm blown up. And I can repeat that. It means nothing to me. I'm just telling you facts. If somebody wants my story, that takes a while to build that trust. And then I'll tell you about, I was lying in that field and I could hear a bird singing. And this bird was tweeting. It was a spring morning. And I was thinking, these are the last moments of my life. What are the things I wish I'd accomplished in my life? And that's what people will connect with. That's your story. And it doesn't matter whether you have the worst injuries or whatever it is. So that's what I'm always trying to find is the person who has a story that I think somebody will connect with because there's an intimacy to it, but there's a relatability to it and something that will make it come back into somebody's mind a day, a week later. So those are the stories. And sadly, I meet some people who have had horrific experiences, but I don't think anyone's going to connect with them. And so am I doing them justice to just document it for the sake of documenting it? No, I have to think about the viewer, the person that's going to react to this, because they're the ones that are going to have the impact and hopefully create some kind of change.
And that, I think, is what separates art from just a media story, is that the way that you're breaking down these barriers to imbue the humanity back into the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is hugely important to do that.
I'm curious, Giles, about grief. And I saw yesterday even you posted that yesterday was the 13th anniversary of you using your prosthetics and trying to walk for the first time. But, grief is something that you have gone through in so many ways that, I can't even begin to understand. But then you're also around so much grief. And so I would love to know what helped you through that grieving process. And then also the fact that you're going into these difficult situations every time, what you use to really to understand other people's grief and kind of deal with that emotionally.
I mean, obviously you're absorbing a lot of other people's suffering and grief. And maybe there isn't a solution to that. Maybe there isn't anything I can say that says, oh, that's how I deal with it. It's part of that process. But for me, it's the knowledge that I'm trying to do something that might support them to get through that, to rebuild. And so how could I not do it? How could I turn away from it, knowing that maybe I have an instrument in storytelling and I have, an organization that can maybe do something, but you absorb it all and that takes a toll. But at the same time, you also have the laughter and the meals shared and the interactions. And, so there's so much positivity and energy that comes from it. You kind of have to accept that the grief is part of that story. And, there's a word that gets misused a lot, I think, which is resilience. And for me, resilience is the one attribute I don't like to find in anyone, because for me, resilience is the outcome of suffering. Resilience is the outcome of difficult, at least extreme resilience. In a sense, every experience you go through in life is stretching the elasticity of your emotional response, which is what builds resilience. Every time you go through change, you build resilience. But people who've been through trauma, suffering, they have this huge resilience. And I don't like it because you kind of know that that's their story. So when you meet somebody who is really resilient, you're like, God, what did you go through? How did you get to that point? I have resilience that was born from a year in hospital and 37 operations and surviving something as horrific as that. That being said, that's often why I connect with people, because we see each other as shared resilience. And resilience is life's gift for suffering. It means maybe you can cope with emotional and physical challenges in the future. But I'd also say resilience means you celebrate and enjoy life more than anyone. So yes, I come across a lot of grief. I come a lot of suffering. I can't do anything about that. I can't change what somebody's been through. But what I can do, and what I often do, is find myself celebrating life with those people, celebrating that we have come through it. And if not, being a beacon through my story and the stories of other people to say, you will come through it. And so there is hope. So that is what I would say is, again, coming back to that very simple mantra of focusing on the things I can control, not what I can't. And I can't take someone's grief or pain or suffering away. I can't change what happened to them. But I can be instrumental in standing alongside them in celebrating their resilience, their survival, their life. I can be instrumental in standing alongside them in their dark moments and reminding them there's a future, in the same way that people did that for me.
It's almost like as if grief were the wind passing you by. It's kind of just understanding that it's around, but also knowing that it's just part of that process. And
I also don't want to over romanticize it, because, I meet so many people. I mentioned at the beginning, this Olive, the genocide survivor, who's this incredibly resilient woman who, lost her whole family in the genocide as a 20-year-old mother. Her children were killed. Her husband was killed. Parents were killed. She suffered immensely, then ended up having to deal with her own trauma and then rebuilding her life. Now she's one of the most positive, energetic, resilient people you could meet. So it's easy to celebrate her life and to use all the references I just did. But at the same time, when I was documenting Olive, I was also meeting women who 30 years after the genocide still couldn't speak, who couldn't look up from the ground, who were so brutalized and traumatized that their lives were over. So, we've also got to be careful not to romanticize resilience and people's suffering and what they become, because sadly there are people that don't get through it. And that's the thing that is hard to deal with, because you can't fix it for someone. I can be there and I can listen and I can share my experiences, but you can't fix it for anyone. And that's hard. That's hard to see and witness and to walk away from. But again, I try and accept that I can't do anything about it. I can give what I can, but sadly I can't. But yeah, there's nothing worse for me than seeing somebody's grief from trauma they've been through and never been able to escape.
Yeah. What's beautiful is that your work does help a certain amount of people. You may not be able to help everybody, of course, but I'm sure there's so much joy and bliss going back and seeing people that you've documented, and they really love that you documented them, years past, and people have seen their story, and you help others be a part of a purpose greater than themselves.
Yeah, I think we can never overanalyze our own impact on others. We just have to get on with our own lives and do it, because again, it may be like the artist overthinking their work and its value to others and its importance. I just live my life and I share parts of that. But in terms of going through the experience of other people's stories, one of the nicest things for me, and the most satisfying, and actually the most important as a critic, is that when I visit people, families. So I was talking about the Syrian refugee families, which was instrumental in how I approach my work. Now I visit them 10 years later. Many of them are living in much more safe situations in Europe. And in their houses, I'll see the photograph I took of them when they were living in a refugee camp or in a really desperate situation. And I think, wow, the fact that they can have that photograph as a happy memory or as a good memory because of the way I captured it, because the photograph will be of, this young girl, Aya, playing hopscotch, or Khulud and her family sharing a meal and laughing, or, Khwala by her tent with her friends, playing a game. That means so much to me that they can still have that photograph as a positive memory, because it's part of their journey and part of their story, and because the way I represented them was not as a victim, was not in a derogatory way, but was done with respect and dignity. So when I see, my photographs of them in their worst moments on their wall, I always think that's a really great reminder that I'm doing things in the way that is appropriate.
Yeah, and maybe for them, it's a way to remember a certain chapter in their life. Of course, their story goes on, but they can mark that as a particular moment that they're building from as well.
So there's an interesting word, kintsugi, which is a Japanese word, which is, if you take something that's really precious, like a family vase, an heirloom of China, an object that was owned by your great-great-grandparents, and then we break it. In the West, we would think, shit, I need to get this fixed so that you can't tell it was broken. So you get it done by an expert that will do invisible mend. In Japan, they go, well, no, we have to fix it with gold so that you see the crack as part of the story. And I love this ethos. And I did a whole series of photographs where we actually ripped up the photographs. And my friend Tony then repaired them with gold.
Amazing.
Because what it represents to me is resilience. Because the stories that we've been through, the traumatic moments in our life, often we hide, we're ashamed of, we feel we'll be judged on. And actually, I think we should celebrate them, especially the psychological scars, and say, these are the experiences, these are the cracks in my story that have made me who I am. And I celebrate them as part of my journey. And so maybe some of those photographs that I've done of people, well, they'll look back and go, well, that was a moment in our life that defined who we are. We wouldn't want to go through it again. We wouldn't wish it on anyone else. But we did go through it. And we are stronger as a family, as partners, or as individuals because of that. And so I celebrate that moment.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because, kintsugi and that idea, and, wabi-sabi is another Japanese idea that I love. But that's a fundamental part of iRay, with my brand. It's, a lot of the time things are hand mended or the edges are left raw, because my idea, and especially after spending years on the retail side around the brands that were selling these like perfect things, the human touch was missing.
Mm-hmm.
And I really believe that, the scars and the different parts of us, that's really what makes us who we are. Through, of course, a fashion lens. That's my, artistic voice that I'm trying to share, is the mending of things and showing those broken pieces.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think as humans, we relate to imperfection. I would use the example in filmmaking of, when everything went digital and all the big kind of films were made on digital cameras. And, Star Wars is a good example. And they made like 3 films that were all digital, but they felt cold. And I was speaking to one of the CEOs or one of the directors at Kodak about how they're reintroducing a lot of old film stocks because there's a huge demand now in motion pictures to use film. And that makes no sense because big commercial films, and I'm talking like, the kind of Marvel comics and films that really are commercial films, it makes no sense to shoot them on film because the costs are huge. So they're only doing it because they've realized that people relate to those films more, that they feel more comfortable with it. And the reason is because there's an imperfection. When you zoom in on the pixels of an image, I still shoot on film. I don't shoot digitally. So I shoot on an old film camera. And I love the fact that when you blow that image up, what you're seeing is these little silver halides, somewhat random. They're organic. And yes, they come together to make a photograph. But when you zoom in, they're not perfect digital squares. There is something organic in it. And I think the human eye deals better with stuff when there is this imperfection. Even if you're not seeing that imperfection, you're naturally seeing it. And so it's the same in everything. So yeah, what you're talking about in design and those details, I think there's a human interaction that happens when things are not absolutely polished and perfect. And we relate to that. And that's the organic form. And, I'm a big fan of a lot of Japanese philosophies and approaches to things, like the idea of always repeating things and going back each day thinking, I can do this better, where, we were probably in the West be going, how can I find a shortcut? How can I work my way around it? If you want to be a sushi chef, you spend 4 years learning how to boil rice. I love the idea that I want to be that person that spends 4 years going in every day going, I think I can boil rice better today if I do it the same way I did it yesterday, but perfect it. I know that after a week, I'll be going on YouTube going, I think I can find an easier way to do this. And so I love that philosophy and the way that design connects with nature, connects with balance, simplicity, taking out all the unnecessary elements that are not needed in something and taking it back to its basics. But yeah, the kintsugi one for me is something that's really beautiful because I deal with people's trauma. I document people's suffering and experiences, but I hope I help them also to see it as something that is intrinsic to who they are and part of what makes them stronger and a person that can have a life with even more fulfillment after their trauma.